Hi there, yeah, my name's Rob Jaques. I am the Garden Birdwatch Reporter Development Officer working for the BTO. If you happen to take part in Garden Birdwatch already and receive our newsletter or have emailed or got in touch about anything, it's probably me you've spoken to at one time or another. This evening I'm going to talk to you about some of the results of the Garden Birdwatch survey, looking at the unusual weather events we've been having in recent years and how we can maybe use the knowledge we've got through the survey to better plan our gardens for more of these events happening in the future, which seems likely to be the case. There we go. I'm assuming a few of you might not be familiar with the BTO Garden Birdwatch survey. It is similar to the RSPB's Big Garden Birdwatch in that we ask people to send us their maximum counts of garden birds. But unlike the RSPB, we ask people to do this every week throughout the year, and not just to do their birds, but also to do other wildlife as well. We have been running since 1995 for looking at birds, and then we began to add different groups from 2003 onwards. And now we not only do birds, we do mammals, reptiles, and amphibians, dragons and dragonflies and damselflies, butterflies, bumblebees, and a few other invertebrate species. People used to pay to take part in the survey. It was £17, and people still do, and they received a magazine. But since lockdown, we launched a free option given the circumstances, and fortunately, people really took to that. We've doubled the amount of people taking part, which is fantastic. We also ask people to let us know what their gardens are like and what they feed their garden birds and other wildlife. So we get this extra data on top of all the counts of the birds we receive. And every week we receive, depending on the time of year, around 6,000 submissions. Anyway, so what I'm going to start by looking at is the spring of 2021. If some of you can remember all the way back then, it was an unusually wet spring. We had pretty much constant rain throughout most of May, and if I remember correctly, April as well. You can see here from one of the Met Office maps, most of the UK received much more rain than is typical for that time of year. And not only was it very, very wet, it was also quite cold as well. Fortunately, because we get data received every week, we can quickly see how lots of different wildlife responds to these weather events. And one of the ones many of you probably pay attention to in your garden is the blue tit. They are still one of our most common garden birds, one that if you're putting food out for your birds, one you'll almost certainly be familiar with. And here we've got a graph looking at maximum average counts per garden across the UK. The red line there is 2021, the year we're looking at. The blue line is the previous year, and those grey lines going back in time are years from the past. And if you can look at everything but the red line, you can see that in a normal year, what typically happens is we have quite a lot of birds in January. As we get towards spring and breeding season, these birds start to separate into their territories, so the counts go down. And then around the beginning of June, we see this really big spike. This is young birds emerging from the nest, up in people's counts in their gardens. And then it kind of varies throughout the rest of the year until we get to the end. But as hopefully you can see with the red line, 2021 was very, very unusual. We saw a massive delay in the emergence of blue tits coming out of their nest. This peak was much later. It was also not quite as strong as we typically see in normal years. This was almost certainly a response to this unusual weather. Blue tits are a species which have a lot of chicks in their nest. They have one brood a year, and they almost literally put all their eggs in one basket and hope for the best. This means that they need a lot of caterpillars in order to raise those chicks. Sometimes I think they can raise as many as 14. I think that's the high count for one female to lay in a season. But normally it's going to be around 9, 10, or 11 chicks in the nest. They need a lot of food to do this. So when we have these unusual weather events occurring during this peak time, we see that blue tit numbers are really, really quickly affected. They have some ability to respond to it. They would have attempted to nest a bit later, but some began quite early and probably found it was quite disastrous. We know from nest records that the BTO also collects that many blue tit nests failed during that year. What is likely happening is cold weather, the caterpillars that these blue tits need to feed their young, they're coming out later, they're a lot delayed in their growth, there isn't as many around for them to feed their young, and the wet weather quite often knocks them from trees as well, which means that as they're looking for food, they're not able to find it. And as they can't provide enough food, unfortunately, not many chicks are produced that year, and we're still seeing these low counts for the tit species up till now. Similarly, great tit, one hopefully you also are familiar with, very similar story. They have a very similar strategy in their nests. They put quite a lot into one nest. They will occasionally have a second brood, great tits, but not very often. But they're even more deeply affected by this lack of food available for their young. Very few chicks coming out of the nest, and massively delayed. And we could see that impact much more than the blue tits throughout the rest of the year as well. I think in November, December there, we had some of our lowest counts for blue tits ever for the last 27 years. But lots of birds will be affected by this in very different ways. The wet will affect lots of breeding attempts, even birds that prefer wetter weather, like blackbirds, who need the soft soil in order to get worms. If there's too much rain, if it's too cold, even they will struggle to find enough food. A species that may be a little bit less familiar, depending on where you live in the country and where your garden is the siskin. These are small finches. Typically, we see most of them in gardens February, March, April. This is a time of the year we call the hungry gap, when there's very little wild food available. Lots of trees have already put out their seeds that have been eaten. There's not many berries. The insects aren't quite out yet, so there's not very much for birds to feed on. And this is normally when we see our gardens being particularly popular with garden birds, as they want to come to our feeders and take the food we provide. What we can see happened with siskins, we didn't get lots of them coming into gardens, but we did see they were coming into gardens a lot later than usual. So those counts in May were quite high for a siskin at that time of year. They are a seed-eating bird primarily. They enjoy eating very small seeds. So in the wild, these are things like pine seeds, alder, birch seeds, and in our gardens, they'll be taking things like sunflower hearts and niger seed. As the rain comes, pine crops often close up. We also see that lots of birch and alder seeds are not from the trees. Siskins start to struggle, so they hang around our feeders a lot more. But what we noticed was that these birds weren't just hanging around; they were lingering. They couldn't go and breed. It was too wet and cold. There wasn't anything to feed their young. So what they were doing, they were spending time near our feeders instead, choosing to feed up and possibly delaying when they had young that year. And we noticed that even in parts of the country where we'd only see this bird really during the winter months, such as southern England, they like conifer plantations to breeding, to nest in, that we're seeing quite high numbers, even quite far away from their nest site. So they were choosing not to migrate and hang around our food sources due to this heavy rain. As I mentioned at the beginning, we don't just look at birds, we also look at a whole range of species, and one of the ones we look at is butterflies, and one of the most fascinating ones we look at is holly blue. These are a bivoltine species, meaning they have 2 generations in a year. Often the spring one is more productive, there's more insects about, but then July, August, we'll see a second slightly smaller generation. 2021 was a seemingly disastrous year for holly blues. Very, very few of them seen, as you can see on the blue line, which is 2020. We had fantastic in April. We had some of our highest counts ever. They were going from strength to strength. This is a species that's also spreading further north, likely due to climate change. And they're doing quite well at this fine warm weather that we tend to get more often now. However, when we got this really incredibly heavy rain, we saw very few gardens reporting these, basically nothing throughout most of the spring. Most of this was probably delayed. They were probably still as caterpillars, or some adults were waiting around, maybe going out in these little gaps between rainstorms to try and breed and feed up. But most were probably hanging around as caterpillars a little bit later than usual, popping up in June, even then still struggling. And unusually in that year, we saw that the second generation was actually a lot more productive than the first one, which is quite unusual for holly blues. And the effects of this heavy rainfall was felt throughout the rest of the year as well. It wasn't just during the spring when it was actually happening. We saw with the great tits and blue tits that their numbers were low for the rest of the year, but impacted beds in different ways. So this is the J. If you live near nice oak woodland, it's probably a bed you're quite familiar with. They'll quite commonly come to feeders. Parts of the country don't get them, places like East Yorkshire, parts of Suffolk and Norfolk, where there isn't many trees, they tend to have much fewer jays around. We can see they were also affected in the breeding season. They generally feed their young a lot of insects, and they would have struggled like many of the other beds. But we saw their numbers shoot up during the end of the year. Many people reporting jays who normally would never see them in their gardens, or at least never seen them before. What has likely happened here is this heavy rain not only affected the birds and the butterflies, it's also affected plants. Oak trees are a wind-pollinated species, and if you have really heavy rain, it's really difficult for your pollen to be picked up. It doesn't spread around. There was a terrible oak crop that year. Most oak trees made very, very few acorns. Jays need acorns in the winter. They spend a lot of their time busily hiding acorns away to help them survive the winter months. Without that crop around, they instead tend to our gardens, particularly peanut feeders. And we saw many, many more coming into the gardens than we would normally expect to see. Sparrowhawks, sometimes a controversial species in the garden, but generally they're an indicator of good health of a bird population. You need lots and lots of birds to hold sparrowhawks, and if you've got a poor bird population, these top-level predators are going to be the first to show it. And as you can imagine, with fewer blue tits, fewer great tits, fewer other birds being able to produce young, the sparrowhawks also took a knock-on effect. We saw that then their young, again, coming out a lot later in the year than we'd normally expect, and then throughout the rest of the year, very low counts. The birds that we normally see during the autumn, late summer and autumn months are going to be juvenile birds that are learning how to hunt. They hang around for a lot longer. When they get a kill, they're a bit clumsy with it. They want to hold on to it, and they tend to take a while to get used to dispatching things quickly and taking them away and hiding. And we get a lot more counts because of these juvenile birds. So when very few juvenile sparrowhawks are produced because their parents can't find enough food to feed them, that's really going to hamper the garden records because they're going to make up a big percentage of the population. There are also yes, moving on, we'll have a look at the most recent summer 2022. I don't think I need to tell many people about what happened there. We had incredibly hot weather throughout most of the summer, record temperatures, and also incredibly low amounts of rainfall there. All those brown areas, basically no rain throughout the vast majority of the summer, July, August onwards. And as you can imagine, that affected birds, but maybe not in the ways that people expected. We often receive people asking when it gets around to August, September, people notice that all of a sudden there's a complete lack of birds in their garden. And this is quite typical. For many birds, the breeding season is over. They don't need to sing anymore. Lots of birds begin to molt, so they want to get hidden away. They don't want to be disturbed. So we tend to see lower counts of most species during this time of year, but for certain species, we saw there were particularly low counts. One of the ones that I wasn't expecting certainly was to see a much lower count of greater spotted woodpeckers during the August months. These are quite common throughout certain parts of the country and much more common species than they used to be. As you can see on this graph here, the dotted line shows an average over all years. The blue line is 2022. And yeah, about 5% less gardens reporting greater spotted woodpeckers than we normally expect. What we believe at the moment is that greater spotted woodpeckers are one of our more herbivorous species of woodpecker. Lesser spotted woodpeckers and green woodpeckers eat a lot more insects. Great spotted woodpeckers do as well, but they will much more happily turn to fruits and seeds and nuts, and that's why they tend to do quite well in our garden feeders. We know that many trees had a really good crop of fruits and seeds this year, and what we think has happened is this glut of food in the wider countryside has pulled greater spotted woodpeckers out of our gardens. That they're not going to risk coming into our gardens where they might encounter people and cats and dogs and curious children. They're going to stick to the countryside where they can find plenty of food, and we think they were probably taking advantage of pine crops. If you happen to live near a pine plantation, there's a good chance you'd probably see great spotted woodpeckers a lot less during the summer this year than you might normally.
Couple of minutes, Rob.
Oh, great. I'll go as quickly as I possibly can. Yes, blackbirds, again, they're a species we do expect to see really suffer during hot weather. The soil bakes, they can't get any food out of the ground because they prefer to pull out worms. And as we get these really hot, dry conditions, they move out of our gardens. They're probably trying to find somewhere that's got some moisture where they can get to the ground. Hopefully, a species many of you saw was the hummingbird hawk moth. They had a record-breaking year this year. We had 4 times as many. The average count went up by 4 times during the August months. There's loads of reasons why this might possibly be. It could be that lots were brought in with these hot winds from the Mediterranean. That probably made up a good percentage of the population, but they seem to be increasing as a breeding species in the UK. And we had this early June influx of hummingbird hawk moths, and maybe some of those were successfully breeding. We may have also had ones overwintering from the year before. I'll quickly talk winter 2022 and 23. We don't know yet, it's not quite over. We had a cold snap back in December when I was writing this, so I thought we might actually see some really big activity. Field fair, this thrush here, which I haven't put in the title, is normally species that we see these big spikes on. Wherever on this graph you see a spike, that will be during some cold, frosty weather. And you can see in December of 2022, we had one of those spikes coming up. We still don't know what the rest of the year will be like. We're getting lots and lots of mild conditions, and this could mean that maybe birds like the field fair, as we get milder and milder winters, we might be seeing fewer of those in our gardens. Anyway, how do we use all of this information? As we know more and more about what birds are doing in our gardens, we can put out food more wisely. If we know that it's been a really bad acorn crop, that's a great time to put out some peanuts. If we know that it's actually a really dry spring, the siskins are probably going to be finding plenty of food in the wider countryside. Maybe we don't need to buy as much Niger seed, and we don't need to risk food going out there, getting wet, becoming a bit disgusting, bad for the birds and bad for people's wallets. We can also use this to guide further research. We've got quite a lot coming up this year. We've got some papers looking at butterfly numbers using garden birdwatch data, which hopefully I'll be able to share at some point. But also, it gives us really good advice for how we can prepare for changes in the climate. I'm not going to talk too much about planting, but it's certainly becoming a growing issue with people trying to work out how to grow, how to have successful gardens in new weather conditions. I think the next talk might be covering this a lot more better than I could. But we can also maybe start to expect some new species coming in. We know nuthatches have been spreading north, and that are becoming much more common in Scotland. We're getting lots of butterfly species moving north, like the holly blues I mentioned earlier. And we may even get some continental species arriving. Southern small white, which is very similar to our small white, has been put forward as a species that could arrive in the UK any year. It's been expected for the last couple of years. If you have candy tuft in your garden, it's certainly one worth looking out for. Or if you'd like to see it in your garden, you live in the southeast, a good one to plant. And we're probably also going to see shifts in habits. So we're seeing more hedgehogs being reported throughout the winter months because they're finding plenty of food. It's not cold enough for them to hibernate, so they carry on throughout the rest of the thing. And we may see some changes in phenology of species. Butterflies can show new generations when we have these long, hot summers. Things like speckled woods can fit in another generation. We're already seeing changes in how diseases appear in gardens. Trichomoniasis used to be a late summer thing. Now we see it all year round. We're seeing new diseases arriving, as U2 in 2020, which seemed to really affect blackbird numbers in London and the southeast. And rhinovirus, which affects frogs, is probably going to be more prevalent as we get warmer ponds. If you do see any diseases in your garden of any vertebrate in your garden, please report to the Garden Wildlife Health. That's a joint project between BTO, the vets at the Zoological Society of London, RSPB and Frog Life to help monitor. We can see these changes as they happen. Hopefully I've not gone over too much there. Thank you very much for listening, and if you'd like to take part in the survey, please join. It's free to do so, and you'll receive a weekly newsletter, and we can keep you informed about all the things going on in people's gardens.